Hello everyone, I'm Hayden, and in this video, I'll be giving you all the tips you'll need to ace your personal profile. I'll be explaining what is the personal profile, how are the personal profiles graded, as well as giving you some examples of how I wrote my own personal profile. So if that sounds interesting to you, be sure to stick around all the way until the end. Starting with what even is the personal profile. So the personal profile is the very fancy name for the part of your application where you write about your experiences other than academics. So essentially just your personal statements. And according to UBC themselves, the personal profile is actually worth 50% of your application, with the other 50% being your academic profile, aka your grades. So this is quite important, right? This is literally as important as your grades. And so you definitely want to do well in this category. So that's what the personal profile is. So how do you do well in it? Well, in order to do that, you definitely need to know how your personal profile is being graded. So if you just Google UBC personal profile, you should be able to see this website. This website is great because it basically just gives you the rubric that they use to actually mark your personal profile. So I'll be going through very quickly the 4 criteria that they care about. The first is engagement and achievement. That basically just means whether or not you participate in a lot of activities and whether or not you do well in them. The second factor is leadership. Leadership basically just means your experiences in any leadership position, be it in a club position or as a community leader or just like a team leader in a team project, Nothing fancy, you just need to talk about your leadership experiences. The third factor is substance, which is a very fancy way of just saying don't pad out your word count, right? You want to be actually saying things of substance. Your entire essay isn't just full of fluff that doesn't really mean anything. You're actually saying things that make sense. And the fourth criteria is voice. They want your essay to sound genuine and authentic, not something that ChatGPT wrote. Which, by the way, little reminder, don't write your personal profile with ChatGPT. Please, I beg you, if you're watching this video, please just write your own personal profile. Don't let ChatGPT write it, man, okay? Promise? Promise. Alright, so with all of that explaining out of the way, let's actually get into my personal profile. Now, I'm not gonna go ahead and say my personal profile is perfect, right? Hindsight 2020, I definitely have spots that I could improve on, and I will definitely be pointing those out as I go. But since I got into UBC, I'm assuming my personal profile should be good enough, so that's why I'm sharing with you all. By the way, don't mind me when I'm looking down here, I'm just looking at the script because the questions are very long and I do not want to memorize them. Oh, and by the way, these questions may change from year to year, and so you definitely want to check out the questions that you actually have to answer. Alright, so here's the first question. Explain how you responded to a problem and or an unfamiliar situation. What did you do? What was the outcome? And what did you learn from this experience? Maximum 1,500 characters. Now, personally, I actually think that this was one of my weakest questions just because my response for it was kind of mid in the sense that for me, I feel like the personal profile definitely should be touching on things that you do outside of school. But because honestly, as a grade 12 student, I wasn't participating in that many things. As you will soon see in this whole video, I wasn't participating in like a lot of activities to the point where I can talk about a new thing every single essay. So for this question, I actually just talked about my experience being in a leadership position in a team project. So just from that description, you can already tell that I was touching on the leadership criteria from the rubric. And so I'll dive into a little more detail of my essay. I won't say it word for word just because it is so long, right? Like each of these questions are like around 200 something words. I don't want to say that many words. So forgive me, I'll just be summarizing my content. But basically, I talked about my final project for a summer course that I was taking. In particular, I talked about how it was a very tight timeline, and as a result, as the leader of the team, I had to take initiative and actually lead the team, help plan out a timeline, and actually hold the team accountable, and actually met those deadlines within the timeline. And at the end, we actually were the only group in the entire class that were able to finish the project on time, and we ended up getting a nearly perfect grade. So that was really good. So I guess since the result was also very good, I guess that also kind of touches on the achievement part of the criteria as well. For this question, I answered it with exactly 1,500 characters, which honestly, I'm pretty impressed by. That's some high accuracy, man. But when I say characters here, I mean every single letter as well as the spaces. And you definitely want to be, I would say, within 100 of the maximum, right? So in this example, the maximum was 1,500 characters. I would say you would want to have at least 1,400. Otherwise, I think you could probably talk a little bit more in detail, or at least like polish up your wording a little bit to make it sound better. All right, so here's the second question. Give us an example of how the pandemic has changed your involvement in the community or group most important to you. What have you learned from this experience? Maximum 1,500 characters. Now, I do believe that they actually changed this question because, pandemic has been a while now. But, back when I was applying, pandemic just happened. And so this is my question. So still listen to it though. Please don't skip ahead. I think it's a very good example of how I use my experiences to answer the questions. And for this prompt, I basically were answering to the criteria of leadership as well as engagement. In particular, talking about my experiences as a senior member at my local Air Cadet squad. In case you don't know, Air Cadets is kind of a volunteer leadership program, and it is one of my highlights on my application. So as you will soon see, I keep talking about it. So I'm not gonna lie, again, this is bad practice. You do not want to be doing this if you can. If you have the experiences to talk about more things, you definitely should, but again, I just didn't have that many things to talk about, and so Air Cadets it is. And in particular, just going a little deeper, this question I answered talking about my experiences as a level instructor at the Air Cadet program. Because all of the lessons used to be taught in person, when we changed into online, I really had to adapt because we now have to be teaching in Zoom, right? And I talked about how that changed my involvement in the program and now I have to deal with a lot of challenges that are very specific to being in a virtual setting, such as having to deal with a lack of participation in a Zoom meeting, as well as having to deal with technical difficulties with Zoom. And I talked about various methods I used to help overcome these challenges, such as opening my camera when I was teaching to help engage the students more, doing more facial expressions, more expressive facial expressions, as well as hand gestures, which you might be able to tell here from my whole video. I'm just doing hand gestures all the time. And I also talked about another thing that I changed in my organization, which was their, notification system that they used to use, which was literally just calling people, which I'm like, my dude, it's not the 1990s anymore. Why are we still calling people to remind them to come to lessons? We should actually just email/Slack them, because we have all those systems set up. Why are we not using them? Why are we calling them? That's kind of stupid and a waste of human resources. And so I was talking about that experience and how I successfully convinced my officers to actually change the system to use Slack and email to actually communicate to the cadets. And once again, this whole story just kind of helps highlight my engagement in this program as well as my leadership aspect of this program. Oh, in this question, I answered 1,495 characters, which once again, I'm not gonna lie, that's pretty damn close to 1,500. So I'm pretty happy with that. So here comes the third question. Tell us about who you are. How would your family, friends, and or members of your community describe you? If possible, please include something about yourself that you're most proud of and why. Maximum 1,500 characters. So for this prompt, I answered 1,429 characters only, so slightly lower than the other ones, but I still think it's definitely acceptable. I started off this response with a very explicit thesis statement, which is literally this sentence, okay? I am a determined person, and when I have my mind set on a target, I will try my best to achieve it. And whenever I'm given a task, I work tirelessly and diligently to ensure the end result is of satisfying quality. So that was basically my whole thesis for this whole question. And then afterwards, I just kept giving examples of how my work reflects that value. I talked about how my friends would describe me as a very helpful person since I helped them with schoolwork. And I also talked about how my teachers would describe me as an excellent communicator, which I said I contributed to my experiences as an instructor at the Air Cadet program. And then guess what? I decided to link this whole story back to the Air Cadet program again and talked about how my growth in the Air Cadet program is the thing that I'm most proud of. I talked about how at first I was just merely just a follower, I was just timid, I wasn't very confident. And then I talked about how after 3 years of being in the program, I started being a regular instructor, I started being a lot more confident, actually communicating better. And in the 3rd year of my program, I was actually given the Rising Star Award, which is given out as a recognition of my leadership and my contribution to the squadron, which I think is once again a very good show of the leadership and engagement factors in the criteria. And in my final line, I talked about how I believe that I have developed a lot of these, like communication and leadership experiences. And I talked about how gaining these skills are tremendously useful for me as I continue pursuing a business education and career. Here comes the fourth question, and I actually think this might be the hardest one. What is important to you? Why? That is so short, but damn, does it hit hard. Once again, maximum 1,500 characters. I actually wrote 1,489 for this one. And once again, I started off my response by laying out a very clear thesis statement. So here is it. Ever since I was young, I have always dreamed of going to a good university and developing a solid career. And that is why the thing I value the most is my future. And I talked about how in order to do this, I've dedicated a lot of my time into developing useful life skills and gaining a lot of interesting experiences. And then this kind of gets a little bit meta, but then I talked about how I know that universities and employers don't just care about academics, but also extracurriculars, which is kind of, this essay. That's why it's kind of meta. But I talked about my experiences in the Air Cadet program again. Yes, I recognize that's probably one too many Air Cadets, or probably like two too many Air Cadets. But, again, that's what I did. Still somehow worked, but, if you can, definitely try to avoid mentioning the same programs like 4 times. I once again talked about the skills that I learned in the program, such as, communication, leadership, stuff like that. I talked about that again. And then thank God, I finally pivoted and stopped talking about Air Cadets. This time I talked about being as a part of my school's ambassador team, where I had to help host the parent-teacher interviews. I talked about how this is a great chance for me to develop my interpersonal skills because I have to talk to people. And then finally, I also talked about how I know that work experience is very important to finding future internships. And so I talked about how I landed an accounting assistant part-time position at a small company. Talked about my responsibilities. It's pretty simple stuff. It's just, data entry, scanning files, whatever. And then I finally just concluded it by saying that I believe that all of these experiences have helped me develop a lot of useful life skills. And I believe that the next correct move for me is to get into UBC and get a good education in order to build a better future for myself. And so this, once again, I talked a lot about my different engagements within the community, as well as just tying it all together as to why applying to UBC would be part of my life plan. Alright, so here's the fifth question for me. Tell us more about 1 or 2 activities listed above that are most important to you. Please explain the role that you played and what you learned in the process. You will be asked for a reference who can speak to your response. Maximum 2,100 characters. I wrote 2,027. And so, as you can expect, guess what I said? I said the most important activity for me was Air Cadets. God damn it, yes, I know, I'm gonna stop repeating myself. Don't do whatever I did. I once again talked about how I learned a lot of useful lifelong skills, such as communication and leadership, as well as some more interesting topics like aviation and survival. And then for some reason, I spent 3 sentences talking about how I learned a lot of survival skills as I was doing my field training exercises with Air Cadets. Honestly, I don't know what the hell I was thinking with that one. Okay, realistically, I know I was trying to show a different side of me in Air Cadets, but realistically, I would not be doing that if I was to rewrite this, just because, bro, that is so unrelated to UBC. You've talked about Air Cadets 4 times in this essay. I don't know what the hell I was doing there. And I also talked about how I developed my leadership and instructional skills in a thing called NCO camps, which is basically just a leadership training camp. And I talked about how I learned more public speaking techniques, how to project your voice, speak with confidence, stuff like that. And then finally, I also talked about a lot of my experiences with gradually promoted in the program, starting with just being an instructor and then being a flight commander, leading a group of 30 cadets during the weekly training nights, and that also helped develop my leadership skills and putting it in action. And overall, this program just giving me a lot of exposure and experiences in just leadership and public speaking, which is very good. The second most important activity for me I talked about was my experiences as an accounting assistant. Again, probably not the best move here because I spent 2 sentences just explaining how I got the role, which is essentially I just nepoed my way into the role. I don't know why I decided to explain 2 sentences to explain that. But essentially what happened was that my accounting teacher was basically approached by a parent who was an accountant, and needed like an assistant. And so that parent can just like approached my teacher and asked her to recommend one of the students to work for her. And she recommended me, right? Of all of like her, like, I don't know, like 60, 90 students, she actually decided to pick me of all people to actually do that part-time position. So I was actually pretty proud of myself for that. And I talked a lot about how I learned a lot of useful office skills from being in that position, which should benefit me going forward in my career as well. All right, and here's the final question on my personal profile. You may wish to use the space below to provide UBC with more information on your academic history to date and or your future academic plans. For example, how did you choose your courses in secondary school? Are there any life circumstances that have affected your academic decisions to date? What have you done to prepare yourself specifically for your intended area of study at UBC? Maximum only 600 characters. I said 556. So again, hindsight 2020, I'm not sure why I talked about this so much in particular, but I talked about how in the like prior to actually immigrating to Canada, I was actually studying. I was born and raised in Hong Kong, where I studied in one of the top high schools in Hong Kong, which ensured that I can actually speak Cantonese and Mandarin fluently. And then in grade 9, I came to Canada, which allowed me the chance to also be proficient in English as well. And I talked about how in the Canadian high school, I actually chose an array of courses, which was basically all of the sciences as well as some social sciences stuff, so that I didn't really close any doors for myself and I kept my options open. And that's basically my personal profile. And before I go, I do want to give you one more tip before I go. Don't worry if your essay isn't good at first, right? For me, do you know how long this thing took? Even though this isn't perfect, this is like version 5 of my essay. I wrote it and then I got my school counselor to look through it. I got my parents to look through it. I got my English teacher to look through it. And then I got my school counselor to look through it again. Like, it literally went through so many versions of revisions. I literally have like 2 full essays that I just ended up scrapping entirely because I thought those stories weren't as good. And so don't worry if your personal profile doesn't look good at first. This stuff is supposed to take time, right? So that's why you have like up to January 15th to do that. So hopefully when you're watching this video, it's not January 15th, That'll be kind of doomed. Please tell me you're watching this in like November or something, okay? So be sure to give yourself plenty of time to actually start early, to actually write your first draft, and then maybe take a break of a week. And then after a week, just look through it again to see whether or not you have new ideas or new ways to phrase words, or just, new stories that you want to talk about. And make sure you show it to different people that you trust as well, right? Obviously you can show it to your friends, but honestly, personally, I would like to show it to more experienced people, like your English teacher or your school counselor that specializes in this sort of stuff. And so I feel like getting an outside perspective on your personal essay is definitely a very important part of actually, polishing your essay, just because sometimes you just don't know when you have written a pile of shit, okay? You really need someone else being there and just telling you, respectfully, this is a piece of shit. You need to rewrite this. And here's a few guidelines on how to improve this. And so do not be ashamed if you need a couple revisions to fix your essay. All that matters is that you get into the damn university, right? That is the point. And so whether or not you have to write your essay 5 times, it doesn't matter. That's part of the process. You don't need to stress yourself too much about the fact that you have to take that many times. As long as you're willing to do it, and as long as the end result is good, then all is good. And that's basically all of the tips that I have for you. And comment down below if you have any other questions that you may have. I'll be sure to answer all of your questions. And here's a few more UBC application videos, so be sure to check those ones out as well. Thank you for watching all the way until the end, and I'll see you over there.